well. Thank you for joining the session. I know I've been introduced, but my name is Jess Modini and I'm a Senior Technologist at AWS. I begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet today, and I extend my respect to their elders, past and present. Before we kick off, and I know everyone's still sitting down, I want to ask a bit of a favour. If your organisation falls within one of the sectors that's up on the screen here, can you put your hand up? Awesome. Welcome to the Critical Infrastructure Club. Now, for those of you who didn't put up your hand, that's okay. You don't need to walk out and leave. We're not going to kick you out. You should definitely still pay attention because the best practices that we discuss today are going to be equally as relevant to you. In a moment, I'm going to invite up Pete to jump up on stage. Pete is the First Assistant Secretary of Cyber Security Policy at the Department of Home Affairs. The Department of Home Affairs is responsible for the central coordination of strategy and policy leadership in relation to immigration, border security and management, counter-terrorism, the protection of our sovereignty and national interests, but most importantly, the reason that we are here today, cyber and critical infrastructure security. As the policy agency, strategic coordinator and regulator, that's a very important one, for cyber and critical infrastructure security, Pete's going to step us through some of the key changes that have come through in the last year or two when it comes to protecting Australia's crown jewels. I'll then jump back up and talk a little bit more about what this means when you're building on AWS and give you a key framework and some takeaway resources so that you can get started with building resilient workloads on AWS. And with that, I'd like to welcome Pete.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Pete Anstey from Department of Home Affairs. The suit and tie probably give that away. I lead the government's cybersecurity and critical technology policy. This includes the design and delivery of the recently released cybersecurity strategy, as well as the policy approach we take to the national security challenges around critical and emerging technologies. Today, I want to focus on the government's work as it relates to critical infrastructure. Australia has never been so reliant on its critical infrastructure. Most of us only think about critical infrastructure when something's going wrong. When there's a cyber incident, a bushfire, an electricity outage, when comms are down, or when food can't be supplied during a supply chain crisis. I'll set out how we're building an all-hazards approach to protecting Australia's most critical systems and how we're creating a more resilient critical infrastructure ecosystem. I hope this helps frame Jess's comments on the great partnership that AWS has with so many critical infrastructure providers, including with government, and how a model of shared responsibility and shared compliance is driving security throughout Australia's critical infrastructure ecosystem. Today I want to focus on three things. Firstly, how we at government are seeing the threat landscape as it relates to critical infrastructure. Secondly, how recent changes to the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, our primary piece of legislation, as well as our recently released cybersecurity strategy, are driving resilience through our critical infrastructure operations. And finally, what does this look like in a real-life context and how is it playing out, using a recent example as a call to action for how we can drive critical infrastructure uplift. To the threat landscape. Increasingly, as I'm sure many of you are having in your discussions around C-suite board tables and boardrooms, a number of the same words have come up over the last couple of years. Floods, fires, cyclones, ransomware, zero-day exploits, malicious insiders, IP theft, supply chain shortages and disruption. In our annual risk review at the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Centre at Home Affairs, we look at these key threats and challenges and how they affect critical infrastructure security. A couple of key themes stand out. Firstly, critical infrastructure is an increasingly attractive target for cybersecurity attacks. We often focus on cyber as the sort of primary threat in this context, and that is because it is particularly acute. In the last 12 months, ASD, the Australian Signals Directorate, has responded to 150 major critical infrastructure-related cyber incidents, and that's a 15% increase on the year previous. Secondly, and perhaps most significantly, is the threat of foreign interference on our critical infrastructure systems. This is a persistent and growing challenge as it relates to critical infrastructure. The Director General of ASIO, our lead domestic security agency, called out in his recent threat update how foreign powers are increasing their efforts to conduct espionage and directly target Australia's critical infrastructure. We know currently there are multiple teams from multiple countries scanning for critical infrastructure vulnerabilities, and we know that water, transport, and energy networks are being particularly targeted. We also know that Australia's critical infrastructure is increasingly connected and interdependent. We know that one significant disruption in one part of a critical infrastructure network, whether that's online or offline, is almost certainly going to spill over into other sectors. We also know what real-life disruptions of critical infrastructure look like. In the last 12 months, we've seen major disruptions to our telecommunications networks, major disruptions to our port networks, showing that resilience to all hazards, not just cybersecurity, is crucial to the continuity of our essential services. In summary, the news isn't great, the threat is present, and it's getting worse. So what are we going to do about it? In the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a real paradigm shift in the way Australia's approached critical infrastructure security and national cyber resilience. At the Cybersecurity Centre and the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Centre, 2 different parts of government, our collective mission is to collaboratively ensure the security, the continuity, and the resilience of our critical infrastructure. Under recently expanded legislation, we have taken an expansive view of what critical infrastructure assets are and captured an all-hazards approach to managing critical infrastructure risk. So the updated law took 4 traditional sectors of critical infrastructure. These were electricity, gas, water, and ports, and expanded that definition to 11 sectors reflecting our 21st century priorities and industries. So these range from data storage and processing, very pertinent today, through to sectors like food and grocery, healthcare, and space. Essentially, what the Act does is provide a flexible framework for managing and protecting our critical infrastructure. These include a few key aspects. The first is, for critical infrastructure providers, a positive security obligation. And what this is essentially a set of enforceable baseline protections, like an asset register of your critical infrastructure, incident reporting frameworks, risk management programs, to protect against all hazards for critical infrastructure and systems. And these are implemented against specific sectoral standards depending on your critical infrastructure sector. The second is a enhanced cybersecurity obligation. So we have particular systems of critical infrastructure called systems of national significance, which we've defined as the most essential and the most critical for the protection of the country. And these providers need to present incident response plans to government, as well as participate in preparatory exercises with government. And the final, and during the legislative planning, the most debated measure was the establishment of a government capability to step onto critical networks in the most extreme scenarios and help private organisations disrupt and respond to these critical threats. In all of this, there's no cookie-cutter approach to how we're delivering the security of critical infrastructure regime, and how together we have to work to adapt the concepts that were already being planned on our networks and deliver them in a new way. And the team at Home Affairs and across government has developed a number of capabilities to provide practical advice to critical infrastructure owners and operators to assist drive this uplift. The ultimate plan is to drive uplift across society and the economy, but with a particular support for our most important critical infrastructure and cyber-connected systems. We've also expanded a number of new sectors that will be regulated under SOCI. In all of this, and a lot has happened in the last 2 years, we recognise we can't set and forget. And so we're emphasising the need with our partners and critical infrastructure providers of the need for continuous refinement of the rules and evolution of our approach for critical infrastructure reform. To this end, we're already updating the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act to introduce a few new measures. The first is a new power called Last Resort All Hazards Consequence Management Power, something of a mouthful, but essentially it's looking to allow government to step in following a critical infrastructure disruption and assist the operator manage the downstream consequences of that disruption. We're also looking to streamline the legislation to make obligations clearer and compliance easier. We're also looking to expand what's called our National Cyber Exercise Program. At the moment, we've conducted industry exercises with the aviation sector, with the financial services sector, and the telco sector, but we're looking to conduct government industry exercises across the spectrum of the 11 critical infrastructure sectors. And I encourage anyone present today from a critical infrastructure owner or operator to reach out to government to involve yourself in these programs. These are really important to have industry and government working together to identify gaps in the way we coordinate our security responses and allow us to plan the flow-on effects from cyber attacks or other disruptions, as what we've seen over the last 18 months is that there's a cascading effect across both industries but also across jurisdictions and geographies when there's a critical infrastructure disruption. What the recent events have shown us is that it's not sufficient to have a plan without testing it, and these exercises are really crucial to building that resilience across owners and operators of critical infrastructure and across government. Finally, given the scrutiny that we've applied to industry across the last 12 to 18 months, it's only appropriate that government looks in its own backyard and gets its own house in order, and we're taking a number of measures across the federal government, states and territories to drive cybersecurity uplift. This includes the development of a whole-of-government zero-trust culture across federal government, which is a major reform for us. The implementation of significant cyber reviews, including the recently launched cybersecurity strategy, as well as the designation of a new group of critical infrastructure systems, and we're calling these systems of government significance. So what does this all look like in practice? In the last 18 months, Australian critical infrastructure networks have experienced both targeted and opportunistic malicious cyber activity and other disruptions. And as I explained, the trend line is only that these kind of activities will increase. As many of you will be aware, late last year, DP World, a large logistics operator, identified unauthorised access on its networks, with containment efforts forcing DP World to close its port operation for 3 days, and this disrupted around 30,000 commercial sea containers. Really indicative of the sort of scale and size of the problem and the real tangible, real-life problems we encounter. This was a major test for the sort of arrangements we'd put in place in terms of our legislative approach, as well as the coordination function of government. So our new National Cybersecurity Coordinator led the government's response to this incident, and he ensured that there were clear lines of communication and coordination during the event. DP World at the same time engaged really collaboratively with its customers, other stakeholders, and with the government through the National Coordination Mechanism, a mechanism stood up to assist critical infrastructure providers respond to these kind of events. During all of that, the Australian Signals Directorate, our lead cyber intelligence agency, and the Australian Federal Police responded to both the technical and the law enforcement aspects related to the incident, and those investigations are still ongoing. Following all of this, we've conducted a lessons learned exercise from the incident to drive industry awareness, to take what we've learned from DP World and instruct other areas and operators how they can learn from this, all to drive capability and security outcomes. Both through organisations like the Critical Infrastructure Centre and through the National Cybersecurity Coordinator, we've used these incidents to speed up the way government and industry can respond and recover from these kind of attacks. Some key lessons, both from DP World and some other major incidents that we've dealt with in the last 12 months, include the real need for consistent and accurate public communications across the parties responding to a cyber incident. So often in these incidents, it's not just the technical mediation response, but the public narrative and the public communications to stakeholders, to the media, to government that follows these kind of incidents to maintain public trust, but also informing other stakeholders. The second big aspect was central coordination of the incident and managing the consequences following from the incident. And the third was driving a real genuine partnership between government and industry to make sure that in the future we're better placed to prepare for and respond to these kind of critical infrastructure disruptions. Ultimately, resilience is a team sport when it comes to critical infrastructure, and partnerships are really, really key. This fundamental shift we've taken to an all hazards approach rather than just a single sectoral approach requires really robust risk management and clear understanding of how organisations and sectors can work together to mitigate these threats. With that, I'll pass back to Jess, who can talk you through how, in a specific AWS context, we can build an all hazards resilience approach. Thanks.
Thanks, Pete. Awesome. So as Pete's covered, the security of critical infrastructure reforms and the new cybersecurity strategy establish a really strong framework for how we approach critical infrastructure security. And I apologize in advance for how many times I'm going to say critical infrastructure and how many times we've said it already. With this in mind, resilience isn't about perfection. It isn't about making sure that your systems cannot be taken down by anything ever. It's really hard to look around corners, but it's certainly about failing gracefully and considering as much and planning as much as you possibly can. Traditionally, in IT, we've talked about things like recovery point objectives, RPOs, and recovery time objectives, RTOs. However, with SOCI and the all hazards approach, we need to think a little bit differently and we need to work together, as Pete's described. So this means we need to take a bit more of a systems of systems approach when it comes to resilience. So this means that we need to proactively build systems that can anticipate a broad range of threats, not just cyber, even though we know that cyber is still very, very important, to make sure that they can face disruption. So let's take a bit of an example here. Let's go with an e-health record system. Say, for example, it's architected in cloud, but maybe just across one availability zone. Now, if we were to accidentally push some buggy code into production, we might have a slight issue with that. If we faced a problem that impacted an entire availability zone, we might need to, at this stage, consider our business continuity plans and consider our disaster recovery options. If there wasn't a disaster recovery plan in place, if we hadn't thought that through, or perhaps we hadn't actually invoked it before, perhaps it's a PDF document that we did once 2 years ago and kind of forgot about and doesn't really work anymore, then we might also have a bit of an issue here. Perhaps if it's not going to fail over to another region, that app is now unavailable. So I haven't worked in a hospital before, but I can imagine that the doctors and nurses would be in a bit of a point of pain. At this stage, they probably wouldn't be able to access patient medical histories, informations around allergies and medications, which would really hinder their ability to be able to treat these patients. At this stage, procedures might need to be cancelled. There could be increased errors and safety risks if you treat a patient without knowing their medical history. I'm sure that's not great, not a doctor, but I'm sure that's not advised. And of course, there would be reputational and financial losses for that as well. From there, there's also the case for other cascading failures that would impact the hospital more broadly. If they can't intake patients because these key systems are offline or degraded or maybe can't be trusted, this is not a good situation. And this is where we would see a system of national significance or a critical infrastructure asset in itself fail. To achieve operational resilience, there are two key things that we need to do. The first is planning, and this is something that Pete has talked about. It's not good enough just to have a plan that you wrote a few years ago and never looked at. It's really important that you do exercises and that you rehearse them. The second is defining your boundaries. So understanding what are your threshold for acceptable disruption levels, because that's of course going to guide our response strategies and of course our resourcing. To do this well, and this is what I really want to focus on for the second part of this talk today, it's important that you understand workload boundaries within your critical assets and the cloud responsibility model in context of all hazards resilience. So this is where I'm going to jump in and do a little bit of a translation exercise here, using the AWS shared responsibility model. For those of you who haven't heard of it, it outlines the division of responsibility between us at AWS and you, the customer, where we're responsible for the security and the resilience in the cloud, so things like physical security and the virtualization layer, whilst you are responsible for security and resilience when it comes to things like data encryption, architecture, how you design it, and things like identity and access management. Now, as you can see, the 4 hazard categories sit across both sides of the shared responsibility model, which means that we need to think about it, and so do you. AWS Australia falls under the newly regulated data storage and processing sector. So we are critical infrastructure. And we recognise the crucial role that cloud services play in Australia's digital economy, and we're really proud to play our part in building an operating technology infrastructure that will help provide greater resilience for all of our customers, whether you put your hand up earlier or not. This is something that you can benefit from. One thing that I want to highlight here that is really, really important and we're hearing is causing a bit of confusion is that Australia's critical infrastructure laws, so the ones that Pete described earlier, do not impact how you can use AWS services. And any obligations that are placed on cloud service providers like us do not flow down, or in the case of the shared responsibility model, up to you. We've spent a lot of time thinking about all hazards resilience already, and our certification as strategic hosting provider under the Australian Government's Public Sector Hosting Certification Framework, or HCF, means that we have already met our obligations under the risk management program requirements of Australia's critical infrastructure laws. You can also select AWS services that have been assessed through the government's Information Security Registered Assessors Program, or IRAP. Sorry, that one's a bit of a mouthful. So that's essentially where an IRAP assessor has gone through and had a look at AWS controls against people, process and technology for the Information Security Manual, which is published by the Australian Signals Directorate's Australian Cyber Security Centre, or ACISC. Now, I know that's a lot of TLAs, and I know that that's a lot of government speak, so thank you for bearing with me through that. The key thing that I want to highlight here is that it doesn't matter whether you work in commercial sector or public sector, and of course, critical infrastructure laws impact both. You can still leverage these assurances for all hazards resilience. Now, a little bit more translation. As a lot of you may know, you wouldn't be at a Builders Day if you didn't. AWS provides a lot of best practice guidance when it comes to building and operating workloads in the cloud. We have our own frameworks that we've developed for this, and the most well-known is the well-architected framework. So I just wanted to highlight this. Horizontally, we've got the well-architected pillars that pertain to these hazard categories. And yeah, that's the way that we talk about it in terms of our language. Now, I wanted to just zoom a little bit deeper into the customer side of the shared responsibility model, which is the side that you're all responsible for. And for those of you that do need to do obligations and meet obligations under the new legislation, this is obviously what is all front of mind for you at the moment. And for each hazard type, I'm just going to give you 1 to 2 key resources that will actually get you started. So make sure that you've got your phones ready for the resources slide that I'll put up a little bit later. Now, I'm going to break the rules here a little bit, and I'm going to run through right to left instead of left to right, so bear with me on that too. And I want to start off with cybersecurity. Now, we know cybersecurity isn't be all and end all, but it is certainly important. And AWS has provided a lot of guidance on this already. When it comes to SOCI and when it comes to any of you that need to do the Critical Infrastructure Risk Management Program, you are probably familiar with the fact that you might need to pick one of 5 or equivalent cybersecurity frameworks. So selecting one is the first task, the second is implementing that. So we help you with that by providing customer compliance guides. So these guides actually work backwards from the security configuration of each of the services that you might have deployed in your architecture, and it helps you map with best practice guidance to key global frameworks. So we've got NIST 800-53, ISO 27001, and HIPAA, to name a few on that list. So this helps you make really informed risk decisions about your architecture because it actually helps you understand, no matter what service you're selecting or using, what that means in terms of shared responsibility model, even if you're choosing abstracted services. Now, the second thing that we need to do is manage the trusted insider risk. We need to make sure that if you've got critical workers that can access your critical infrastructure or disrupt it, are going to be blocked. So when it comes to doing this on cloud, managing identity and access management is key. And yes, pun intended. Multi-factor authentication is a quick win here, as is implementing zero trust strategies within your environment. We have a session called COP 205 on managing critical identities, which is a session that I highly recommend if you want to dive a little bit deeper on best practice for this. Thirdly, supply chain. It's important that you do this at the macro level and understand what this means for your organization, as well as understanding what it means in terms of what's actually in your workloads. So we've got AWS Supply Chain that helps you unify your data and make decisions at the macro level. And then when it comes to your specific AWS workloads, I highly recommend using Amazon Inspector because it actually allows you to create a software bill of materials so that you can get that visibility. This is essentially a nested inventory of all of the open source and third-party software within your environment. So it can help you understand your software supply chain, things like your most commonly used packages, which is really great if you've got a list of vulnerabilities that you need to compare that to help you prioritize. Lastly, physical security risks. When building on cloud, this is all about resilient architectures, and this is something that I cannot stress enough. For critical workloads, we recognize that you should probably consider at least multi-availability zone. Don't be like the eHealth system. But of course, if you're trying to mitigate against something like a large-scale event that might take out a region, it's certainly worth considering multi-region architectures, at least for disaster recovery. Now, we provide a lot of guidance on this. There's obviously trade-offs between choosing a single availability zone, multi-AZ, all the way through to multi-region, and I'll provide you a link on that shortly. In Australia, we are so lucky to have 2 regions. With Melbourne region launching last year, we can now establish regional isolation boundaries for critical infrastructure workloads between Sydney and Melbourne, as you can see above me at the moment. This is really, really critical for super high availability if you are running crown jewels on AWS. This is the most important slide of the session. So I'm going to just pause here for a second so you can pull out your phones. I really think it's important that everyone walks away with some tangible things that they can do as next steps for uplifting your workload's resilience on AWS. And hopefully we've provided a little bit of clarity about what this means in terms of the translation and context of the legislation. And thank you to Pete for that. That was wonderful. I just want to re-emphasize that we're here to help. If you have any questions on the legislative side of things, policy, please reach out to Pete and his team. And of course, we're always here to help you as our AWS customers. So please do reach out to me if you have any questions about what this means for you. This is certainly a partnership and a team sport, as Pete said earlier. Technology makes innovation possible, but it's the people who are going to build tomorrow. Check out Skill Builder. We've got over 600 free digital courses. And of course, before you leave, please don't forget to rate the session. Feedback is certainly a gift, and I would much appreciate that. Thank you all for coming along this afternoon now, and enjoy the rest of Summit. Thanks again to Peter.